Hi everyone, welcome. I'm Prashant. I lead the demand gen here at Privado. Thank you for joining us today. We are going to be talking about the GM CCPA settlement, one of the largest CCPA settlement enforcement action to date. We'll be covering key takeaways, privacy program readiness for the second half of the year, a couple of house rules before we get started. We are recording the session, and the recordings and the slides will be shared with everyone afterwards. So you must look out for the email. Please feel free to use the question and answer tab to submit your question. We'll be keeping an eye on it and we'll answer as many as we can during the session and at the end. Also, today's webinar qualifies for one IAPP CP credit. I'll be dropping the instructions in the chat soon. With that, I'm excited to introduce our speakers today. We have Daniel Goldberg from FKKS. Daniel is a privacy attorney who has been closely tracking CCP enforcement. And we have Meredith Grauer from Peloton. She brings the in-house privacy leader perspective on what all this means in practice. With that, Daniel, I'll let you kick us off.
Great. Thank you, Prashant. Hi, everybody. Good morning here from Los Angeles. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are today. I am Daniel Goldberg. I chair the data strategy group at Frankfurt Kurnit. We are a mid-sized law firm that specializes in technology, advertising, entertainment, and privacy is a huge, huge part of the work that we're doing. I've done a number of webinars with Privado, and today I was invited to help lead and moderate this panel, which is going to be amazing. And we're going to be talking all about the GM case, but more importantly, the takeaways for what that means for businesses. And I'm joined today by an awesome attorney, Meredith Grauer, and we're going to do quick introductions. So again, the title today is Key Enforcement Lessons from the GM Settlement. And we have a deck for you. I can make this deck available too via PDF. If anybody wants it, please shoot me an email after this. So again, I gave my background. I'm chair of the data strategy group. I do a ton of work in this space. My office is in California. So in particular, I do a lot of work and very familiar with what's going on in California law, as well as specifically dealing with regulatory enforcement. So Meredith, thank you for joining me here today. I want to give you a chance just to give some background about yourself and kick us off.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Prashant, for having me. Really excited to be here. I currently lead the global privacy team at Peloton, but I've also led privacy teams at TikTok, Nielsen, a company called Marqeta. So I've been in-house doing privacy for more years than I want to admit. But really excited to talk with this group and share kind of my insights as to, when we see these regulatory enforcements and these new laws coming, how we think about them practically, when you're in-house, what they mean and how you can translate kind of these takeaways into actions.
Yeah, perfect. And that's exactly right, is that a big part of today is not just looking at the case, but again, understanding what this means for business. And so thank you, Meredith. We're going to, having the practical perspective, I think is so incredibly helpful. So we have a deck for you, as I mentioned, a number of slides. Before we get into the case, I want to give you some background about what is going on with enforcement today. And specifically, we're not looking at litigation in the privacy realm. We're looking at regulatory enforcement. So the big takeaway for everybody here, and I've said this recently a lot, is that privacy enforcement is no longer theoretical. It is actually happening. We've seen a number of enforcements in the last year, in particularly brought by California, by the various California regulators. I'll talk more about that later. We've also seen enforcement in other jurisdictions. We're not going to be focusing on that as much. But what I want to also say is that many of the investigations that we're seeing are not public, right? So this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is what we know of. This is what's been made public, but there's a lot of stuff that isn't. The other thing is that when these cases are brought to settlement and revealed to the public, there's a lot of other stuff that goes on behind the scenes. There's a lot of stuff that does not come up. So just be aware, it is often much more complex than it looks. And the other thing is that the costs are much more expensive than they look. So sometimes you look at an action and you go, okay, well, this wasn't that high, the costs of compliance, the costs of actually dealing with the injunctive provisions can be very, very pricey. So again, looking at that as exposure. So with all that, exposure is increasing tremendously. We're seeing enforcement driven a lot now, not by companies that have not done anything, but by companies that had operational failures where they thought that they had something in place, but it didn't work, or there was a disconnect between the business. I'll talk more about. I think the GM case has some really good indicators of that. Um, and regulators have moved beyond just saying, oh, what does your privacy policy say to actually does this work, right? So does it actually do what you are intending it to do? And I know with Privado, one of the discussions I've had with them and what their product does, right, is looking at the scanning to make sure that things are actually working as they should. And that's a really, really important thing for companies, whether using Privado or another technology solution, basically understanding what's going on your websites and also your various services. Settlement amounts are also increasing for similar violations. So again, looking at things from a few years ago is not necessarily indicative of what the penalties would look like today. So take everything you see here with kind of grain of salt and say, okay, well, just like inflation, the numbers are going up too. So this is an image of just a basic graph of where we've seen the enforcement by California Attorney General's office over the last few years, starting in 2022, going up to 2026. And as you can see, there's been a pretty gradual incline. You have some outliers, but generally, it's somewhere really in the millions range, I would say at this point. Very rarely are we seeing things that are under $1 million. And again, this is just the settlement. Similarly, we have Cal Privacy, which enforces in California, and really they've only been active within the last year, primarily with enforcement, public enforcement. And again, you can see the numbers are going up. So I want to talk about the GM settlement. That slide did not include the GM settlement. So what we're going to do today is for the next few minutes, I'm just going to give a quick overview about what happened. And then Meredith and I are going to talk about the lessons from the GM settlement, dig in. And I think that, that's where we'll spend the majority of our time today. So background on the settlement. So this settlement came out on May 8th, so about, a little bit more than a month ago. And the settlement is substantially larger than anything we've seen. It was for over $12 million. When the settlement came out, it was publicly disclosed on various blogs with California Attorney General's office and Cal Privacy, and that generally always happens. What was interesting here is that it was actually brought by a number of enforcers together. So it was the California Attorney General's office with various district attorneys as well as Cal Privacy assisting. And there's some reason for that, and I'll talk about that with some of the background of the case. But here's just the general explanation about like what happened in the case is that allegedly from 2016 to 2024, GM collected driving data from vehicles, and that includes the speed that consumers were driving at, whether or not there was hard braking, rapid acceleration, and they were also collecting as part of that precise location, which was, GPS of where the car was located, including where they parked. And this was collected for anyone that had a GM vehicle that had subscribed to OnStar. OnStar also had a smart product associated with it that people could supposedly opt into, where it was kind of a gamification of driving. And so the driving data was collected in connection with that. Where things get kind of interesting here is in 2020, based on the allegations, GM started selling that data that it had, the driving data, to two data brokers, LexisNexis and Verisk. And as part of that, it was basically the purpose was to develop insured driving rating products. They made about $20 million nationwide, per the allegations. And then in 2024, that practice ended. As of the data that they were sharing, interestingly, the data set was different that they were sharing with Lexus versus Verisk. With Lexus, they were sharing, in addition to speed, hard braking, and rapid acceleration, they were selling that geolocation data. And Verisk's contract expressly barred that. We'll come back to that. That's relevant later. And part of the issue based on the allegations is that the privacy policy, if you looked at GM's privacy policy, it stated it did not sell driving behavior or geolocation data. Okay, so the background here is also pretty relevant about the investigation and how it unfolded. So in 2023, Cal Privacy announced that it was launching a connected car sweep. And so it sent letters to a bunch of vehicle manufacturers asking about their data practices. And allegedly, GM responded and did not basically said, here's what we do with the data. We use it for these purposes. Probably talked about their website, but they did not mention the sale of data to Verisk or LexisNexis. In March of 2024, so after this happened, the New York Times broke an article that basically said that they were selling data to Lexis and Verisk for insurance purposes. And this was a major, concern to a lot of people. So the California Attorney General's office, along with various DAs and the assistance of Cal Privacy, reopens a joint investigation of this and looks into it. Okay. So there was a certain set of statements that were allegedly made to the regulators. The regulators were relying on that. And then after this New York Times article broke, they reopened the investigation. I bring that up because I think that one of the reasons why the number is so big here is because of that, because of the process that, they're the allegations that they basically, there was a misrepresentation about what they were doing. Okay, so again, that's why I think, and we'll talk about some of the other reasons why the numbers are really high here, but that's a really important thing to know about the case. Okay, so what was actually alleged, and again, we'll talk about the specifics, that there was no notice or opt-out for the sales of data. There was no mechanism to limit the disclosure or use of sensitive personal information, which was the geolocation. There was a violation of purpose limitation, a violation of data minimization, and also a violation of false advertising law and UCL. Interesting, again, looking at all these things, and we are going to dive more into these in a few minutes. And then, of course, partially like, why do we care? We care because the monetary penalty and the injunctive relief was pretty significant here, right? So 12.75 million, it's the largest penalty to date. Interestingly, there have been other settlements recently brought with GM over the same alleged conduct. FTC had a similar resolution or settlement earlier this year, and zero penalties in that one. So just demonstrating about how California really is the jurisdiction to be looking very closely at because there's really are real penalties. Also, pretty big bans on what they can do with the data, requirements for deletion. An interesting one, they have to get affirmative consent before collecting, using, or sharing the data moving forward, specific consumer controls about the data, and a 5-year written program with annual assessments and reporting that has to actually go to the highest levels. So bringing that all up because this is pretty substantial. Okay, so now Meredith, I want to make sure, right, we both have time. I want to make sure you get in on this as well. So we're going to talk about the 7 enforcement lessons that we see from this case. And a big part of it, again, is going to be talking about what does this mean for in-house? How do you think about this? What are the challenges operationally for this? So
Yeah.
the
And
first,
Daniel,
yes.
before we move there's an open question here right now from Adam. What does it say to you that the CA penalties look higher than what the FTC assessed in its OnStar settlement earlier this year?
Okay. So going to that question, what it says basically, first off, the FTC, so there is no federal privacy law. So the FTC on an initial violation does not have the ability really to level significant penalties. Usually what will happen is they'll enter into some type of a consent order. And then if there's a subsequent violation, that's where you see the penalties. So the other thing is that in this, just under the current administration, we see less of a focus on privacy. That's just kind of where we are based on in comparison to the Biden administration. And so really what it says is that regulators are all looking very closely at this, and a lot of times regulators are looking together. So the various states, and interesting here, right? You saw a bunch of different regulators in the same state brought it, but it can show you how different states and different locations provide different amounts and recourse for penalties. Um, so yeah, really, it's indicative, I think, of where things stand right now and why we have these specific webinars that are so focused on California as opposed to other jurisdictions, is that California really is a higher risk jurisdiction. So let's talk about the opt-outs. This is something that we have seen in every California case at this point, right? The opt-outs must actually work. Allegations around sales and that the opt-out's not working. So what do regulators expect? What regulators expect under California privacy law is a single mechanism covering all sales and shares that works across systems and services. So this is basically one-stop shop. I click opt out and I am done. It works across the website. It works across mobile apps. It works across vehicles. In the GM case, allegedly GM offered an opt out on its website, but when you clicked on that opt out, it had zero effect on the data flowing to LexisNexis or Verisk, right? So there's an opt out. The other issue here is that there weren't sufficient disclosures, and the disclosures also potentially, misrepresented what was happening. But when we look at the issue with the opt outs, it's the fact that the scope did not apply as broadly as expected. So this is, I put this here as the pattern, is that this is just the latest in a number of cases. Interesting thing about this case, as a side note, this is really the first case that doesn't deal with ad tech. All the other cases are ad tech, but this was like a real quintessential sale of the data. So, but if you look at that, taking a step back, it doesn't really matter if it's ad tech or not. In these other cases, like Sling, like Disney, like PlayOn, all of them were a situation where they offered an opt-out, but the opt-out did not broadly enough expand to all the sales that were happening with the company. So the point here is that if the opt-out doesn't cover all your data flows, it really isn't an opt-out at all. Now, Meredith, I think this is where I want us to jump in and have a dialogue here.
Yeah.
If you can talk about, give us some background analysis about what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of different things that I think about when I'm looking at these cases, right? I think it's there's does the opt-out work, right? But then there's also the Disney case in particular sort of struck me because it's this notion that, when someone makes an opt-out request, you need to apply that across all of your services, not just systems, right? And I think for a lot of us, our systems are segregated and we have different business units and they don't operate as one kind of integrated, easy to find everything set of information. And so there's a real engineering and business buy-in kind of question here. Are you actually linking your data? I think so for an action item, you ought to know that because I think one thing that was really interesting is the regulator did call out, right? Like Disney, you're able to you have this identity graph, you can link all these different devices and emails and whatnot for your advertising purposes. Therefore, you should be able to do that for your opt-out. So if you are doing that for any other business purpose, then they certainly, I think, are going to expect that you can do it for opt-out. But I think that is something that requires companies to really understand your data flows, like where are people logging on? How many different experiences do your users have that you need to look at and try to figure out, can you combine these in one under one choice mechanism? So really knowing your data flows, understanding, can you link them? Do you do that already? I think another issue that I think about is the dynamic use of trackers, right? Like, especially if we're talking about kind of the cookie consent piece that is often changing very quickly on your site and in your apps, the different parties that you're working with, and trying to stay on top of that and make sure that those are categorized correctly and integrated with whatever consent mechanisms you're using. And so, privacy teams and whether you're legal or engineering or product, we all need to be kind of connected all the time to be able to do this and make sure we're staying on top of all these changes. And then the last that you alluded to is testing, right? We see so many cases where it's like, oh, well, they had a consent platform pop up and I made choices and nothing happened. So you can't stop there. You can use a Privado or other services to actually scan and make sure, are cookies firing before, or is data flowing, when you've said someone can stop, a particular activity. So
That's great. And one question I get a lot is around buy-in at the highest organization level. Like, how do you think
yeah.
about that, Meredith? I know it's tricky.
Yeah, it is. And I think I have worked at, organizations that are always, everybody's always resource constrained. I think everybody hears, hey, there was this action or it's a legal requirement and they want to do it. But trying to work your way up to the chain to make sure that the business really understands the implications of not doing it or doing it on a timeline that is, I'll say, fast enough, right? I mean, again, as I said, this isn't necessarily flipping a switch for some organizations. Sometimes you acquire a company, and so there's a whole different ecosystem and log on and whatnot. And so, I think it's really getting out and talking to your stakeholders, helping them understand kind of the environment, the why, and also the business benefits, right? I mean, there is a brand aspect of this. You want folks to trust your company, to see that, privacy is taken seriously. So it's both how can I prevent the bad thing from happening, but also, how can this be a business enabler to us? And I think, making sure you're having that conversation in both kind of directions or from both points of view is helpful. But I think it's a lot of meeting and talking to different stakeholders to help them understand the why and what you're really trying to accomplish.
I also think something that's going to change part of that analysis is that we're seeing a greater focus on personal liability, right? Where individuals are going to have to be providing attestations to regulators about
Yeah.
having conducted certain impact assessments. We'll talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah.
But it's really easy to say, oh, this isn't that much money, et cetera. Um, I'll tell you what one thing that strikes me about this case is like all the allegations here for a business the size of GM, it was only $20 million, right, that was made on the sale of the data here. And so again, what makes part of this is the fact that somehow or another, some division here, this got through, and likely other divisions didn't know that that was necessarily happening. And so it's just buy-in at the highest level, also understanding really, really closely, what you're doing across the organization. So it is, it's very tough.
Yeah, I think one thing to add, because another thing that really struck me is, sometimes you might get leadership say, oh, that, it's not that big a penalty, but the injunctive aspect. So I saw, delete all the data, right? Like that might get your business's attention much more quickly than saying you might pay a fine, because no one wants to have to delete all of their data and start over.
So I got a great question here. I love this question that says, privacy is often framed as a risk avoidance. Have either of the panelists ever seen successfully framed as a revenue driver by a company? I will tell you, so this has been one issue in my career I've also thought about where, we for a very long time called our practice group the privacy group. And what would happen is everybody would go, oh, no, I don't want to go to the privacy group. This is where things go to die, right? We renamed ourselves data strategy. And I think that that has been really helpful. And that is what I think the way you look at it is how do you leverage data that you have in a way that is legally compliant in that you can actually be a revenue driver for the company if you come up with a framework to say, this is how we're going to use the data. And I think one of the lessons we're going to talk about can go directly to that around de-identification, that Privacy Council is not saying you can't use the data for purposes. It's saying doing something like this, where you're straight up selling consumer data, is very risky, and the upside is probably not worth the risk. And if you take certain measures to work within the compliance framework, I actually think you can make a lot more money in the long run because you can use it for analysis, for AI. It's just actually using the specific identifiable data is the issue. But I'm interested, Meredith, if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, obviously there's, sometimes it's harder or easier depending on the industry that you're in to kind of make the case for it. But I am a privacy professional, or I've been in this area for a long time, but I also do believe companies can and should use data. So I think again, I like the data strategy, right? Coming at it from the perspective of I'm here to help you find the right way and the best and safest compliant way to use the information we have because it is an incredible asset for our business.
Awesome. One last thing I want to just mention about the opt-out stuff before we move on is that there's a lot of confusion in the marketplace around opt-out requirements and what it means. And a lot of the vendor tools that I've seen out there focus on GDPR. But there's also this overlay where you have SIPA issues and you have CCPA opt-out. And so I would just say, again, this is an area where I've seen a lot of companies go, oh, I have addressed the do not sell because I have the GDPR cookie manager on my site, and they're not thinking about things like this, a good example where it is a completely different element of the business. This is, website versus connected vehicle space. And so I just, being really, really careful to understand what that means to opt out because again, I just think a big part of it's a misunderstanding, misnomer, and we just need more knowledge out there about it.
Yeah. Danielle, I know there's a couple of questions. And the first in the chat, what is your view of hashed email, hashed phone numbers being identifiable data and data sharing flows? I will tell you, I've always taken the position, assume they are, because I think the regulators will take that position unless you can really show there is no way to practically re-identify them. But I'm curious, what you advise clients or what you've seen from some of these cases that you've worked on.
I completely agree with you. I think that a lot of what we see is what is the outcome? So you can, as a company, take all these measures to protect the data, but if ultimately the outcome is like a one-to-one re-identification of that device to give that specific person that you know within a segment an ad, I think you are in the place where they would call it pseudonymized. So it would still be considered personal data under a lot of laws. And that's the tricky part.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so we got a lot of good questions here. I do want to move on, and we can come back to some of these questions in a bit around anonymization.
Yeah.
And good question about sensitive data. We're going to get right into that now. So, lesson number 2, and we all know this at this point, anybody who's been in the privacy space for a while, is that precise geolocation is considered high risk sensitive data. So, what do regulators expect? So, under California law and others, right, there's this, well, specifically California says if you are going to use sensitive data, which includes precise geolocation data, for a secondary purpose, so it's not the primary business purpose of the data, you must offer a mechanism to limit the use and disclosure of the sensitive personal information. And so, again, that's usually in the footer of the site, and it says limit the use and disclosure. And in this case, the allegations are that GM sold precise location geolocation data to LexisNexis without having that mechanism, right? There was no mechanism in place. What's interesting about this is that there are a number of states now that are straight up banning sales of geolocation data. Maryland, Virginia, Oregon, I believe Connecticut. We have a number of them now that are putting these in place. And so this goes to a trend that we're seeing about sensitive data. And so Meredith, I know, again, curious to hear about what your analysis is, what you've seen in this space over the years from being in-house, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, I think you just laid out the challenge, right? Which is this is continuing to evolve, and states are kind of one by one passing new laws. And it's not just geolocation data, because I immediately, my brain went to these health data laws, like in Washington and Nevada, that are also quite broad and sort of vague in terms of what is, considered health data that's protected under these new laws. So I think, having a clear kind of definition and categorization within the company is helpful so that everybody's on the same page. Like, here's what we think is sensitive, and educating business stakeholders so that they understand like different rules might apply, or we might not be able to use these in the same way. And it is a constant, again, it's sort of a constant effort and constant battle as the laws change and evolve. Identifying potential sales, being aware, is there anything that we set in motion 2 years ago that we have to revisit now? Because I think, this goes for a lot of these issues, privacy review is often this one point in time when the project starts, someone comes to you, you look at it, you give your advice, and things, get iterated over time, and people don't always come back to check in with legal or privacy teams, not for any bad reason, just they don't view the change as big, or again, they're not aware that these requirements have changed over time. And so I think it's really just, again, that making sure that you have that clear information for folks to understand, like, this is what we need to treat as sensitive data, and understand that, different rules apply. And also, again, just going to some of these cases, make sure your disclosures and your choices keep up with this as well. Because again, I think that's sometimes I say forget, but we look at our privacy notice once a year. We review these, not each time something changes, but we probably should.
There were so many good takeaways in there, Meredith, about, I mean,
Or it was
I
a
think
mouthful.
no, it was a mouthful. But I want, just thinking about how true a lot of that is. So the sensitive data point, I actually think is such a good one about characterizing it or categorizing it. Okay, so precise geolocation to me is like an easy one. We know what
Yeah.
that is generally. It's very, very specifically defined in the law. And so this is kind of like a little bit slam dunk. But where we see things, I think the really interesting case that was indicative of what California was thinking was Healthline, right? Where Healthline talked about last year that there was a disclosure of URL that was basically indicating what somebody had looked at on a website, along with some of their IP address and personal information to show who they are. And that could actually be indicative, the fact that somebody was looking at a article that talked about health conditions that people should be thinking about who read that article, could actually indicate that person's specific health conditions. And so I think that is one where it's a little bit more gray to say, okay, well, how broad does sensitive data go? And so when you're thinking about this team, I think you're right. There's like bright line rules where you go, okay, well, this is definitely sensitive data, but then it starts inching into, well, was that sensitive data? I don't really know. And so it really depends on who you're dealing with and what your business model is around to that. And I would just say, for me, the takeaway is sensitive data is kind of a moving target. I think that there are some industry groups like NAI that have done an amazing job at talking about like what sensitive data is. So I just would be very careful for in-house teams that go, oh yeah, like we know what it is. Like that's not sensitive data, because you may be surprised what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the other is, try to know your customers and your users, right? Because it's what would they, I mean, I often a benchmark is what would they think? Would they expect you to have or use this data in a certain way, or would they feel that that's more intrusive or invasive? And I think that's sometimes a good barometer as well.
I agree with you. And that leads us perfectly into the third lesson, which is purpose limitation, which is all about what you just were saying, Meredith. So what do regulators expect with data collection? That any data that is collected may only be used for the purpose that it was collected or another undisclosed compatible purpose. Now, there were three allegations around the GM case that I find really interesting here in purpose limitation. So the first is that they said their disclosure to brokers violated purpose limitation because that was never disclosed in the privacy policy. Okay, so that goes to this idea about reasonable expectation. In order to have reasonable expectation, know about it, right? Like you also have to know and see it being disclosed in the privacy policy. It has to be something that, they would kind of expect was going on. And it has to be, disclosed and compatible with the other use cases. That's number one. But the second one goes farther, right? Really interesting, that says, well, even if it had been disclosed in the privacy policy, which it wasn't, using data to provide a connected car service, right? So this is data that was collected through OnStar for the purpose of providing OnStar um, services and using that data to develop unrelated driver rating service for insurers likely would fail the compatibility test. And that goes to reasonable expectation, right? Saying, well, it's not really compatible with the original purpose at all because consumers, wouldn't have expected that this was happening with data that was being used to provide the service. It was sensitive and like they just wouldn't. And then the third point here, which they go even farther, which is really interesting. This is something we have not seen before, that basically says where the purpose itself is unlawful, which is using driving data to set California insurance premiums. The law prohibits that. That could almost never satisfy a purpose limitation at all. So that makes it look like this would be a ban that in general, a lot of ways that companies, deal with purpose limitation is that if it doesn't meet it, you can potentially get consent. So if you provide notice and consent in the way that our frameworks work, that would be sufficient in order to be able to say we can use it for a specific purpose. But this is going beyond that and saying that, again, because the purpose is unlawful, even if they had consent here, it probably would not have been permissible at all. So lots to take away. Meredith, I would love to hear what you think about this because I find these some of the most interesting elements of the case.
Yeah, I mean, I did. I think I was seeing the future in my last comment, right? I mean, I think first of all, just even understanding, what is a compatible purpose, right? And who decides that? Because as we were discussing earlier, like I think businesses do iterate and things change a little over time. Um, and the fear I always have is, I don't want to have a thing where people have to come to me every day, every time they, touch something. But on the flip side of that, what a business team perceives as a small change to a product might actually have big privacy implications, right? Because they're looking at it going, oh, well, we already have this data. We use it for these 10 things. Like we should be fine to, we have a notice, we got consent to collect the data and use it for these. We can just do this other thing. And I'll put a question mark at the end of that because that's not always the case, right? And one I think that probably a lot of teams are grappling with that again came to my mind was, you have all this data like, hey, can we now use it to train our AI models for something, right? And like, when is that compatible or when is that really an entirely new purpose? And do you need to get consent or is it just a disclosure? So I think, again, we need to have the sort of constant kind of dialogue, just open kind of exchange with our business teams, train and educate our business stakeholders to have them understand, use that kind of what would the user or customer think as a barometer, or at least a starting point, as to whether this is kind of the same purpose or something different. So yeah, I mean, all of this, I sort of feel like I'm repeating myself,
Totally.
but it's
No,
these are really hard ones because again, I think the business, everywhere keeps moving and privacy often can't be in the room for everything.
mhm. And okay, so much to unpack, right? So
Yeah.
one, I find that a lot of teams want to collect data and they don't always know why they want to collect it, but they're like, if we get a lot of data, we're going to have huge, huge value here. Okay. And so you just have to be really careful with that notion because, again, the regulators are saying here, like, look, you can't just be doing that and collecting the data and not have a reason for the collection. Everything needs to be collected for a specific documented reason. And we're definitely moving more and more towards that framework right now. Um, so I think the AI training is also such a big part of this because we're seeing it. And this is part of the reason why you also need to be carefully looking at your privacy policy, I would say at least annually, if not biannually, to make sure that the disclosures are accurate. And I think it's much harder to make a change that is a massive change, right? You don't update your privacy policy for like 3, 4 years. It's going to be much bigger because there's a lot of things that have changed in the law. But if on an annual basis you look at it and you go, okay, well, we previously have said we can use the data to improve our services, I think using that potentially for AI training could map on okay. You probably want to be more explicit about what you're doing, but that to me could be potentially compatible. But we're seeing that kind of moving, it's a moving target right now. And as the laws start coming down, and if we do see a law that says, well, you know, using AI or training for AI for some purpose relating to insurance is prohibited, that's something you have to be taking into account here because that could fundamentally impact everything that you're doing with data. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's really interesting, and that leads, I think, very closely to data minimization. And this
Yeah.
is the one that is, that when the regulators released this case, the settlement, they talked a lot about how this is the first one to deal with data minimization expressly. I do think some of the prior cases have implicitly dealt with it, but this one talks very specific about it. And so we'll get into it. What do regulators expect? They expect that a business's collection, retention, and sharing of personal information must be reasonably necessary to achieve the purposes for which the data was collected. So what does that mean? Basically, that means that you should not be keeping the data longer than you need it. You should not be using the data in ways that you don't need to. And the GM case really stands for this and shows it. So in the GM case, according to the allegations, they started collecting this data through OnStar in 2016, and they were using it for the OnStar services, but they didn't start selling it until 2020, right? 4 years later. So there's a question here. They're like, well, you retained this data for years beyond what was needed to operate OnStar. Why did you have that? And so, Meredith, I think this was the point I was previously making, right? It's like you're just collecting data for the sake of it. There should have been deletion of this data earlier if it didn't have a reason for existing at this point. Now, maybe if there was a legitimate basis, and this is the tricky part is what is legitimate. Well, maybe if you need it for fraud, if you need it for demonstrating records. But here, again, there didn't really seem to be, based at least on the allegations, and again, behind closed doors is much more complex, but based on the allegations here, there didn't really seem to be a reason to be retaining it for that long. The second part here, which I think is really interesting, is that so they had contracts with both Lexus and Verisk. Verisk specifically said, do not provide us geolocation data. Like we do not want precise geolocation data. But in the Lexus contract, it didn't say anything about that. It was just said, here, provide us the data, and like these are the data points. And they sent over a bunch of the vehicle data, but they also sent over this geolocation data that Lexus never even used in its product at all, like wasn't necessary. And so what was interesting here is that the regulators said, well, you sent over location data that they never requested and didn't need for the product. And you really should have known because Verisk said, don't send this to us. So you sent over more data than was necessary, violating data minimization. That's fascinating because I see, companies doing that all the time, sending more data than that's necessary, and it's very, very tricky. So Meredith, let's talk about the analysis because I'm sure you got lots to say here.
Yeah, well, you were saying businesses want to collect more than they need. They also want to retain for the like what if scenario. I think so. I fully agree, right? Like it's really important both for collecting and retaining data to be able to articulate a very clear business reason for why we have it in the first place and then why we're keeping it for whatever period of time we're keeping it. But the conversations with your business teams can be really tricky because there's a lot of fear, I think, from businesses of like, well, 1 year might be enough, but it might be that in year two, we'll think of something else or need it because some, crazy thing might happen. And so it's not so easy necessarily to figure out what is that right time and what's that time where you have a very clear kind of story that makes sense. Figuring that out and working together to get to that point. The other thing I've seen is, there's often a lot of stakeholders working on retention policies, and sometimes they're really tricky to actually implement because they aren't mapped to particular systems or particular teams. And so you sit and go, well, okay, this data element, I said 2 years, and it's in this system, this data element that, is joined with it is 6 years. So I think we all could probably do a little better sometimes to really think about what those policies look like and, can we implement them? Also, do we have our data flows mapped? Do we even know where the data is sitting? So these are, I think, some of the real challenges that we face when we're trying to think about how to create those policies and then how to actually implement them. And,
Yeah.
I'll stop there for a second. Yeah.
No, there's so much. I mean, I think that the longer so companies that have been in regulated industries that are dealing with sensitive data sets have done a very good job generally in dealing with this data minimization element. Why? I think a lot of it has been dictated based on data breach laws, where the risk is very, very high that if you have a data breach and you have a bunch of social security numbers, you are going to have reporting obligations. And historically, for non for pieces of data that are not triggering data breach in the US, there's a lot less of a need to delete that data because you're kind of like, well, what's the biggest risk that happens like if we don't delete it, right? Or if we have an incident, it doesn't matter. It's not reportable.
Yeah.
And that's where I think this is a big change here is that we are seeing the regulators, well, okay, it may not be reportable under data breach law necessarily, but like now it is an obligation under CCPA. And so I actually expect to see a lot more of this as time goes on. And the other thing is that's important is that if you're working across borders, GDPR and other regulators do require notice of breaches, for even things like IP address and stuff like that. And so, um, you know, depending on who you're collecting it about, the point is that I think some of that lackadaisical data retention, where especially it's in marketing or it's in sales, that's a lot riskier these days too. And also, this goes to the idea about contracts is not having the right information in the contracts. Okay, so let's talk about general privacy program accountability, because this is a big one. This one is what do regulators expect? A business must have internal records of processing operations ready to provide to regulators, including risk assessments for high risk processing. Risk assessments became a specific requirement actually starting this year in January. But there are going to be formal requirements over the next several years if you are engaging in processing that requires risk assessments to report those to California to actually go online. And that's what Meredith and I were talking about earlier, mentioning is that somebody is actually going to have to go in and have personal liability on this, where they're going to have to basically attest that the business conducted these risk assessments. So in the GM case, GM allegedly had its own internal privacy program, which had been in place since, and I believe this was actually supposed to say 2019, not 2010. But when requested for risk assessments around this selling to Lexus and Verisk, they could not provide it. And it appears that the personnel were unaware, the personnel that were asked, right, when these inquiries came in by Cal Privacy, about the data broker sales in the original inquiry. So what I believe goes to is what we talked about before about having, it's really difficult to look across the business and have accountability across the business. But Meredith, I'd love to hear if you could talk a bit more about this, what your thoughts are.
Yeah, and I think you just hit the nail on the head, right? I mean, one of the trickiest things is like there's often not one place to look for, this information, right? There's not one team or one system that gives you the full picture. And you often have, either a compliance team or a privacy legal team or your privacy office that is going to be the team that is responsible for maintaining these records and maybe making that attestation. But usually this isn't the team that is actually hands-on doing the work. So we're often relying on all these other stakeholders to give us accurate, complete, updated input. And that's, It's tricky. I didn't mention earlier, I mean, one thing I talk about reaching out to different stakeholders. I've had, privacy champions programs or similar at some of the organizations I've worked at. That can be a really great tool, again, just for having, designated points of contact within your business and your engineering teams who are kind of your eyes and ears and can help you both disseminate information out and keep you apprised of, what's going on. So you don't want to no one wants to be kind of the pain in the behind or kind of overly intrusive, but it's just a way to keep getting accurate and up-to-date information. Certainly, folks, if you have, in California or elsewhere, I mean, you should be checking to make sure you have records for particularly your higher risk or your main data processing activities if you haven't done that. And I would say even think about not just a review cycle for your privacy policy, but for your DPIAs and your ROPAs and whatnot, because I think one of the things we've been talking about is like things do change and things evolve. And even a contract that gets signed with, here's what we said are the services or the purpose. And again, over time, we just know that things they move a little bit and things get expanded and no one's doing it in bad faith, but it just doesn't always get documented or shared with all the right people. So having, a cycle for updating those documentations is helpful as well.
So I just got a question here that I want to answer live in the Q&A that says, would a privacy impact assessment be sufficient for this risk assessment? And so I actually think using what you already have in place is super helpful. Like this is not reworking everything, but California has specific requirements about what has to go in that. So if you are relying on, if it's like a GDPR impact assessment, make sure that you put on an addendum to that, like looking at the requirements for California, because it's not exactly the same. Maybe it's like an 85% overlap. Curious, Meredith, if you have thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I mean, again, these are the hard realities, right, of trying to balance that, not having something that's 100 pages long, but also trying to, make sure you've addressed all of the regulatory requirements. But I think, these are good guides. And if you know you have to make an attestation, I would probably be, again, take what you have and then look and do a gap analysis for California or other jurisdictions where you have similar requirements and see, what the easiest way to either incorporate those points is.
So I want to talk now. We're starting to get lower on time, so I want to make sure we get our last two lessons in here. This one is about data brokers. So first important point here is that this is not a case against a data broker, right? But it is a case of a company dealing with data brokers. So what do regulators expect? Businesses that receive data from or sell data to data brokers must provide adequate notice and meaningful opt-out. I would also add here expectation about conducting due diligence because there are obligations for companies that engage with data brokers. I know that there's been a lot of focus recently on regulating data brokers. We'll briefly mention that in a second. But really, again, it is relevant that if you are working with data brokers, also an issue here. So in the GM case, what happened? Allegedly sold data right to these data brokers without sufficient notice or opt-out. So what is the broader signal? There's a lot of scrutiny in this area. Cal Privacy has said that regulating data brokers is one of their top priorities. There have been, enforcement groups created to regulate data brokers and look at data brokers. And very relevant right now, this new Delete Acts drop mechanism, which requires data brokers to process consumer deletion requests every 45 days. That mechanism goes into place and begins the requirement on August 1st, 2026. So we're like just a few months out of that at this point. It's very close and upcoming. Um, Something that you got to be really looking at closely is evaluating like, are you a data broker? And for a lot of companies, you're not a data broker, but if you're dealing with data brokers, what is that going to mean for us moving forward? Meredith, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, and I'm going to just raise one question that came in that I think is specific to your slide. Can you expand on why a company receiving data from a data broker without further selling it would require an opt-out? And is that correct?
That's a great question, Jennifer. Let me tell you where that actually comes from. That actually comes from the Disney case. And in the Disney case, Disney received data from a data broker. And there was, when you look at the actual settlement itself, the settlement required Disney to process requests for cross-context behavioral advertising. And I believe it could be read in a way to say that it wasn't even if they were further selling. Now, so very nuanced answer is the point that this was in the context of a settlement, so I don't think it's broadly applicable. But I do think it is indicative of what the regulators are thinking about and saying here. So again, I don't think companies should be going out and doing that necessarily. But remember, some of these laws are broader too, where they don't just regulate sales and shares, they also regulate processing data for targeted advertising. So it's internal use of the data. And so my guess in Disney is that they may have already had opt-outs in place for processing so they could agree to this generally broader opt-out. So yeah, the point is that there are obligations that can be interpreted for those companies that are receiving it. And if nothing else, they're looked at, very closely. Also, if that data that they're receiving is bundled with other data that is then sold, that could make the company a data broker. So you just have to be really careful in this area is the point. There's a lot of nuance for each company. So
Thank you.
we're getting closer on this is like the last lesson. We do have some questions. I'm sorry if I don't get to your questions today. Please reach out after this. I'm happy to answer them and talk with you through it. De-identification. This is one that I actually think goes directly to our original point that we talked about earlier. And one of the questions that we had is, what would have happened if GM had tried to anonymize the data or de-identify it? So what do regulators expect? Interestingly, California says, right, that if you meet de-identification standards, you are not subject, that data is not subject to privacy law, and you don't have to comply with the obligations of privacy law. So a lot of privacy counsel, right, in-house have said, well, why don't you take measures to de-identify it? De-identify the data, and then you can actually be outside the confines of it. But here is the issue. The issue is that what a lot of internal people, salespeople, et cetera, marketing people think is de-identification is not actually de-identification, right? There are specific standards as to what that is. It must be genuinely de-identified with safeguards, prohibitions, a public statement, and you can't allow for re-identification by third parties. So this is that push-pull where it's like, okay, awesome idea in practice to de-identify, but are we actually meeting de-identification standards, or is this more pseudo-anonymization? So in this case, what I thought was so interesting about it is that when you read the settlement talks a lot about how GM had to delete its data and it had to push some of these obligations downward on the data brokers. But it said that where that data was de-identified, it did not have to delete it in certain instances. And this is different than what we've seen previously with things like the FTC, where the FTC has said in the Biden administration, you have to disgorge all the benefit you get from the algorithms that you develop, right, based on that data set. That's not what is here. So what I would say is, I think this is a big signal that de-identification techniques, if they are done properly, if done right, work, and it's something that the regulators are recognizing as something that is valuable. So in a way, I look at this as kind of like incentivizing to say, like, if it's done correctly, or if it had been done at the aggregate, right? So if perhaps GM had said, I'm just speculating here, we had 10,000 drivers that were using OnStar and X percentage of them had, these issues. That's more aggregate level. I think that would be something that would be really, would be something that would be doable, and you can still monetize that for research purposes. It's when you're using it at the individual level and selling it, that's where the problem is. So Meredith, I don't know, just real quickly, if there's any takeaways you want to say is, in-house counsel at the end, everybody can take a look at this slide. Final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, just as I think, one, I would say it's a team effort, right? So if you're not having regular dialogue with your engineers, your product folks, your security folks, you definitely should be. I mean, I think there's so many layers to all of this that I think we all can't do it alone, and we need to be checked in with each other. So that would be my one
I
big takeaway.
I 100% agree with you. And I think that's the point is that like these are things that it's much better to be structurally like thinking about this early on before an action comes and to understand what's going on in the organization, to be working with outside counsel and in-house counsel, and to have a plan and documentation ready. Because if it turns out you don't have that, as you can see from this case and from others, that's a lot where companies really, where the regulators dig into that. Um, so with that, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you everybody for joining me, but especially Meredith, thank you for being an
No,
awesome
thank you.
co-panelist
Yeah.
with me on this. And Pravado, thank you for having us today. Really appreciate it. If anybody wants to reach out again, I know that there were SIPA questions I could not get to. I know there were specific questions about impact assessments. Please reach out. Would love to help with that. And Prashant, I give it back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel and Meredith. It was a wonderful session. I think a really valuable session with lots of great lessons. We will be sharing the recordings and the slides to everyone shortly. Look out in your email. I've also dropped a link in the chat for our next webinar. We are going to be covering EU AI Omnibus Agreement and the latest UK ICO online tracking guidance. We have two great speakers lined up for there too. That's it for today. Thank you everyone for joining. See you next time. Thanks. Bye.